Manisha Patel is a senior partner at leading housing architects PRP, and she's also a mayor's design advocate. So Manisha, perhaps I can start by asking you what you think the impact of the pandemic will be on the design of housing. And let's look first at multi-tenure developments in terms of space standards, open space, building types, that sort of thing.
Space standards seems to be really working quite differently for different income groups. And I think this pandemic has kind of taught us that if you've got the ability to have a home where you've got open space, you've got the standards inside, you've got the separation in terms of being able to work at home, kids being able to have homeschooling, and you have the ability to be able to separate off into different parts of your home. What we found is in terms of flat living, the ability to do that is quite limited. And especially if you're living in social housing, like for instance, in a lot of the estate regeneration schemes we're working in, some of the homes on existing estates are substandard, not to the current GLA standards, slightly smaller, smaller kitchens, not the ability to separate off. And so I think that we're looking at what happens post-COVID, not just internally in the build, internally in terms of the flat, which, the flexibility I think needs to be there in the future to be able to close off spaces, the ability to be together, but also separate. And we need to be thinking about how our hallways work, how spaces which you use night and day can be adapted for different ways of living, and also different ways that people can work from home, the ability for kids to be able to do homework, the separation of different generations, and that goes outside the home as well in terms of how your corridors work, how are you going to be passing, because I can't see us wearing masks for the rest of our lives. It obviously has a cost implication, and as we know, developers don't tend to want to add any costs to buildings, but I think that housing associations are already starting to look, and we're working with a few where they're starting to look at how communities are working together, how you use those outdoor spaces, how the inside of the home works. As we know, around the UK and in London, there are many homes still that don't have balconies in terms of high rise, and how we can look at this in the future. I find it quite shocking still that homes are developed outside London that still do not have balconies in terms of flats. London insists on having flats, which is a great standard. They could be a bit bigger, they could be more flexible. The idea that flats that have balconies themselves are spaces that could be used for home working, the ability to be heated, the ability to be closed off, and to be sort of more multifunctional. And around the country, we have the national standard, but that still doesn't specify that you need to have, every flat needs to have an outdoor balcony space. So, there are things that we need to really, as an industry, start looking at, not just in London, but countrywide. And open space, we've always advocated in master plans, and I've always been a great advocate for the fact that open space is always an important part of our city, and every development should have usable open space that you can make choices in, not just thoroughfares, because we are designing a lot of new developments where it's routes rather than usable open space where you can visually see people, but the width and the length, the width, the depth, the uses within there, you can separate safely, but you're also able to have that privacy. And that it's quite important as the city gets taller and taller that we provide these spaces for health and well-being.
Thanks. Now, one of the most shocking aspects in recent months has been the death of old people in care homes. So how do you respond to that as a designer?
Well, as PRP, we've got a specialist housing team, and we've been working within this area for years. And extra care and care homes are slightly different in terms of the way that they operate and the type of living. Care homes have been affected, but we've started looking at how we can create infection controls and how design can enable infection to be controlled within the care home environment and the extra care environment by the way that it could be intervened currently, but also how you can have separation but integration in the future. Because quite key that we've learned from this is that families have been separated from people who are actually living in care homes. And it becomes important how those kind of open spaces can be public as well as private, because if you're completely isolating people within a building form, you're also creating loneliness. And loneliness is almost the biggest killer, really. And so the idea that you can have those spaces and people can come and visit their family through external spaces on the outside of the building as well as the inside of the building becomes more and more important. We're starting to work with Housing Lynn in terms of writing papers specifically about bringing infection control and design forefront.
You've long had an interest in multi-generational living and intergenerational housing. Would that have helped, and will that increase post-COVID, do you think?
The word multi-generational always seems to bring up things in the media where they're talking about people living within communities, and it's multi-generational tends to happen within low-income groups or ethnic minorities, for instance. I think there will be an increase because, just throughout every culture, that support mechanism in families and has become quite important with the separation of different age groups, people living apart, not being able to see their grandparents. And I think that, what we did on the Olympic Park in Chobham Manor, the idea of the multi-generational house would have been ideal in this time where generations could have lived together and also been separate. And the idea, if anyone had an infection, it was able to be controlled within the home environment. And I see that happening more. We're already designing multi-generational flats and seeing how that would work in the different tenures. Currently, there seems to be a lot of interest in the affordable sector, but I do see it as a product which will make its way into the private sector, because in an urban environment, you need that kind of support throughout life. I call it design of cycle of life.
PRP are launching a book called The Estate Book in September. Tell me about that.
But we felt that with our experience in estate regeneration, it was important that we shared the kind of really good principles that have come out in terms of the things we were talking about previously: open space, tenure mix, diversity, looking at the different typologies, and engagement, because engagement has become, a really important factor in terms of housing. And the guide looks at the principles and the successful ways that regeneration can happen, because the estates are not just dealt with as a red line boundary now. They are mixed tenure schemes. They're wider, they're connected up. They're also put into strategic sites where other land is bought in. So we've looked at this, and we've touched on it in an educational way so that people can get knowledge from it. And we see it as more of a guide than a book, that it's something which people will learn from, and hopefully academics will also pick up, so that they, people who are doing urban design can be picking up the principles from the outdoors right the way into the detail of the buildings themselves. The conclusion within there touches on COVID and about what we should be doing in the future to push design and technology, and how technology, the NHS, can actually become quite strong factors with design moving forward within housing, and how we connect all of that up to, I suppose, create those intergenerational communities where it stems from that village feel, where communities can have a choice to stay and live within the same area and not be shipped off to the coast, for instance.
One final question, to go back to an early point you made about lack of balconies. Do you see the possibility of retrofitting tall buildings or larger buildings without balconies in the way that firms like Lacadan and Vassal have in Paris and Bordeaux? These are very successful retrofits.
I definitely think that there is a possibility, but we have to be mindful of building regulations and changing standards as well, and structure. Some buildings, I think, work really well if they can be retrofitted. That has to be considered in the pot, because some have been done very successfully. Winter gardens that can be almost plugged in on the outside of the building could be quite successful as well. And we need to look at this. We need to look at this for our existing housing stock, because some of the housing stock is incredibly well detailed, solid. So it's a mixture of how we would think about regenerating whole area, but it needs to be on a case by case basis.
Manisha Patel, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Peter.